The war
Soldiers
had
of
been
Rome, the
going
hour
on for
has
14
come.
years.
Advance
14
with me
years of
now.
burning skies, broken moons, and dead soldiers buried on planets that did not belong to them. 14 years of the Valdori Imperium pushing forward, and 14 years of humanity pushing back. Nobody had won, nobody had lost, but both sides were tired, and tired soldiers make mistakes, and mistakes in a war like this meant dead cities. The Valdori were not a weak people. They were ancient. Their empire stretched across 30 star systems. Their ships were faster, their weapons were stronger, and their soldiers had been fighting wars since before humans had learned to write. They had won 100 wars before this one. They expected to win this one too. They did not expect Elias Cord. Nobody really did. Cord was a commander in the Terran Armed Forces. He was 42 years old, with short gray-brown hair, a jaw like a stone wall, and eyes that had seen too much and forgotten none of it. He was not the biggest man in any room. He was not the loudest. He did not give speeches about glory or victory or the pride of humanity. He just showed up, looked at the problem in front of him, and solved it, over and over again, in ways that made his enemies feel like they had missed something very obvious. The Valdori called him Sharvorath. It was a word from their old military language. Their translators said it meant the unbreakable. Their scholars, the ones who studied him more carefully, said the real meaning was something older and stranger. It meant the one who should not exist. He had turned the tide of 17 major battles. He had held a bridge with 9 soldiers for 6 days. He had walked into an enemy field hospital under a white flag, treated their wounded with his own hands, and walked back out. 1 week later, the enemy unit that owned that hospital switched sides. He had survived 3 assassination attempts, 2 orbital bombardments, and 1 situation that the official military report described only as the Kessler Incident, with all further details classified at the highest level. The Valdori High Council had spent 4 years trying to kill him. They had sent their best blade dancers, their finest snipers, their most cunning intelligence operatives. Every single attempt failed. Not in dramatic ways, not in the way of action stories, where the hero jumps over explosions and lands perfectly. It failed quietly. Cord would simply not be where they expected him to be. Or he would already know. Or he would already be ready. After the 7th attempt, one of the Valdori generals said in a private meeting that killing Cord was not the problem. The problem was that Cord was the kind of man who made everyone around him harder to kill too. His soldiers fought differently. They thought differently. And that, the general said, was the real danger. So the High Council did what ancient empires do when they run out of good options. They called a meeting, a long one, with a lot of arguing. And at the end of it, they came up with a plan that nobody in the room actually liked. But nobody could find a better answer to. They would end the war by ending it on paper, a peace treaty, a real one with teeth, and to make it binding under Valdori law, to make it something that could not be quietly undone by the next council or the next emperor, it had to be sealed with a union, a marriage between the two sides. Not just any marriage. Under Valdori imperial law, only a union involving a member of the first house, the ruling family, carried the weight needed to make a peace treaty truly permanent. It had to be the queen herself. Queen Velshara of the first house was 38 years old. She had been ruling the Valdori Imperium for 11 of those years. She was tall, sharp-featured, with silver-white hair that she kept tied back during council sessions. She was not warm. She was not soft. She had ended 3 internal rebellions, negotiated 4 trade agreements that tripled her empire's resource income, and once dismissed an ambassador from a neighboring civilization mid-sentence because he had started lying to her, and she had simply lost interest. She was respected by her allies and genuinely feared by her enemies. She did not like the plan. She made that very clear. She sat at the head of the council table and let them explain it. And then she sat in silence for a moment. And then she said, "You want me to marry a human soldier to stop a war we should have won 10 years ago?" The council said yes, more or less. She asked which human. They told her. She was quiet again. Then she said, "Fine. But I want full control of the ceremony arrangements, and I want his military record on my desk before any agreement is signed." On the Terran side, the reaction was different, but equally complicated. The Senate had been looking for a way out of the war for 3 years. They were tired of the cost, tired of the funerals, tired of explaining to their people why the fighting was still going on, when both sides had already lost more than they had ever expected to lose. When the Valdori proposal came through diplomatic back channels, the Senate read it 3 times, argued about it for 2 weeks, and then voted to accept it. Then someone pointed out that they had not actually told Cord yet. A senator named Breck, who had the job of delivering bad news to important people, took a transport to the front line, where Cord was currently stationed. He found the commander in a temporary command post, eating a cold meal over a map table, marking positions with a stylus. Breck sat down across from him and slid the document across the table. He explained the situation carefully. The treaty, the Voldori queen, the marriage requirement, the Senate's decision. He explained that it was legally in order, but that they wanted Cord to understand the full picture before. Cord had already picked up the document and was reading it. He read it slowly, turned the page, read the back, set it down, picked up his fork, ate a bite of his cold meal. Then he said, "Does my combat pay transfer over, or do I get a new contract?" Breck stared at him. "That's your question?" "It's a reasonable question," Cord said. Breck told him they would work out the details. He asked if Cord had any other concerns, any feelings about the situation, any reaction at all. Cord looked at the document again. Then he looked up. "I've been fighting this war for 11 years, he said. "If marrying their queen ends it, that's a better outcome than most of the options I've had in front of me." He paused. "What's she like?" Breck opened his mouth, closed it, said, "Complicated." Cord nodded like that was an answer he understood completely. He folded the document, put it in his jacket pocket, and went back to his map. The war had 14 years of weight behind it. Billions of lives changed, hundreds of worlds scarred, and the man being sent to end it was sitting in a cold command post, finishing a cold meal, already thinking 3 steps ahead. That, more than anything, was the most human thing about him. The Valdori capital ship was called the Eternal Throne. It was the largest vessel in the Imperial fleet. It was longer than some cities, with halls made of dark stone imported from the Valdori homeworld, tall ceilings carved with the names of dead emperors, and corridors wide enough to march a full military column through without touching the walls. Everything about it was built to make visitors feel small. Cord stepped aboard in his dress uniform, carrying 1 bag, and looked around the docking bay the way a man looks at a hotel room he is going to sleep in for 1 night. He took it in, noted the exits, and kept walking. Queen Velshara did not meet him at the docking bay. That was intentional. In Valdori culture, the one who waits is the one with less power. She had arranged for him to be received by her head advisor, a tall Valdori official named Sovereign, who had spent 30 years in the imperial court, and had a face like a polished mask. Sovran greeted Cord with careful, formal words, and led him through the ship toward the reception hall. Along the way, Cord spoke, not about important things. He asked about the ship's engineering. He mentioned the load-bearing structure of the upper corridors. He pointed out, casually, that the ventilation system in the East Wing used an older design that the Valdori had stopped using in their newer ships. Sovran stopped walking twice during this conversation and looked at Cord the way a man looks at something he thought he understood, but suddenly is not so sure about. When they reached the reception hall, Velshara was already there. She stood at the far end of the room. Her robes were deep blue, her silver-white hair was tied back, and she held herself the way all rulers learn to hold themselves. Straight, still, giving nothing away. Her eyes were pale gold, which was common among the Valdori high families, and they were fixed on Cord from the moment he walked in. She had read his military record. She had read it twice. She knew the numbers. She had prepared herself to meet the legend. She had not quite prepared herself to meet the man. He was not what she expected. He was not loud or impressive in the obvious way. He walked into the room without any performance, stopped at a respectful distance, and gave her a greeting in Old Valdori. Not a simple phrase, a full, formal address, with the correct honorific structure, the right tonal inflection, and the specific verb form that was only used when speaking to a reigning sovereign. Old Valdori was not a language that foreigners learned. It was a language that Valdori scholars spent years studying. It was not taught outside the empire. Cord had learned it from intercepted battlefield communications, cross-referenced with captured documents and a grammar text that one of his soldiers had found in a bombed-out Valdori command post. Savron made a small noise behind Cord that he would later deny making. Velshara said nothing for a moment. Then she replied in Old Valdori, using the formal equal-to-equal form instead of the superior-to-lesser form she had planned to use. She was not entirely sure why. It had just felt wrong to do otherwise. They ate dinner together that evening in the ship's smaller dining room, which was still large enough to fit Cord's old command post inside it 3 times. The conversation was careful. Velshara was polite in the way that sharp people are polite when they are still deciding what to think. Cord was straightforward. He did not try to impress her. He answered her questions directly and asked a few of his own, mostly about trade routes and supply chains, which was not what she expected a soldier to ask about. By the end of the meal, she had not changed her opinion of him, but she had noted several things she had not expected. She filed them away and said good night in the formal Valdori style. He replied correctly, again. 3 nights later, the assassination attempt happened. It was a quiet night on the ship. Most of the senior staff were asleep. The corridors in the guest wing were empty. 3 figures in dark clothing moved through the ship using a maintenance route that did not appear on the standard crew maps. They were blade dancers, the best the anti-peace faction could afford, trained from childhood, silent as smoke. Each one had ended more lives than they could count. They reached the corridor outside Cord's quarters at exactly the time they had planned. They did not rush. One of them checked the door. It was unlocked. That should have been a warning. Velshara was woken at the 3rd hour of the night by her personal guard, who told her there had been a situation in the guest wing. She dressed quickly and walked to the corridor. Cord was standing in the hallway outside his room, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. He was in the simple gray clothes he slept in. He was not injured. At his feet, in various uncomfortable positions, were all 3 blade dancers. They were alive. They were bound with strips of torn uniform material. They were very unhappy. Cord was eating a ration bar. He looked at Velshara when she arrived, then looked at the 3 on the floor. I heard them in the maintenance shaft, he said. Old ventilation design. Sound carries differently than they thought. He paused. 2 of them are wearing Imperial Guard insignia under the dark clothing. Your people should probably look into that. Velshara looked at the 3 on the floor. She looked at Cord. She looked at the ration bar. Are you injured? She asked. No, he said. They are 3 of the best fighters in this sector, she said. I know, he said. I recognize the footwork of the one on the left. She was at the Battle of Seraph 4. Good soldier. Wrong job tonight. He finished the ration bar, folded the wrapper, and put it in his pocket. I didn't want to hurt them badly. They were just following orders from someone who doesn't want this peace to happen. The someone is the real problem. Vel'Shara stared at him for a long moment. She was very good at reading people. She had spent her whole life learning to read people. She looked at this human man standing in a hallway at the 3rd hour of the night, having just defeated 3 elite assassins, and the word that came to her was not dangerous, though he was. It was not powerful, though he clearly was that too. The word was steady. He was the steadiest person she had ever stood in a room with. She told him to get some sleep. He nodded, said goodnight in Old Valdori, and went back inside his room. She stood in the corridor for a moment after the door closed. Around her, her guards were already dealing with the 3 on the floor. Sovereign appeared beside her, looking shaken. He was already awake, Sovereign said quietly. The sensors show he had been awake for an hour before they arrived. He knew they were coming, Vel'Shara said. It appears so. She turned and walked back toward her own quarters. She had more thinking to do. She had thought that coming into this arrangement, she was the one who held all the power. She had a throne, an empire, 30 star systems, and an army of millions. He had a bag and a dress uniform and a ration bar. But power, she was beginning to understand, was not always what it looked like from the outside. Neutral Accord Station sat between 2 stars in a stretch of space that belonged to nobody. It was built for exactly this kind of meeting. Wide halls, neutral colors, no flags on the walls. Every room designed so that no side could claim it felt like home, and no side could claim it felt hostile. It was the most carefully boring place in the known galaxy, and it was full of the most important people from 2 civilizations trying very hard not to look at each other in the wrong way. The official negotiations were handled by diplomats, men and women who had spent their careers learning how to argue about borders and trade and reparations without anyone drawing a weapon. They sat in long rooms with long tables and talked in careful circles for hours each day. It was slow, exhausting work, and most of the real progress happened in quiet side conversations over bad coffee at strange hours of the night. Cord and Vel'Shara were not diplomats, but, under Valdori treaty law, the bonded pair, the 2 individuals whose union would seal the agreement, were required to be present and visible throughout the negotiation period. They were required to attend joint functions, share public meals, and be seen together by delegates from both sides. It was symbolic. It was meant to show that the union was real, not just a signature on a piece of paper. It meant they spent a great deal of time together. Vel'Shara had prepared for this by telling herself it was simply another duty. She had performed duties she disliked her entire reign. This was no different. She would be present, she would be correct, and she would feel nothing particular about it. That plan lasted about 4 days. The first thing that changed her thinking was something small. On the 2nd day of the negotiations, there was a public reception for delegates and support staff. Vel'Shara was working the room the way she always did, moving from one important person to the next with careful words and the right expression. She glanced across the hall and saw Cord standing near the back wall, talking to a group of people she did not immediately recognize. They were not diplomats. They were not military officers. They were human refugees, civilians who had been relocated to the station during a recent Valdori offensive near the border colonies. They had been given temporary quarters in the lower levels. Nobody had invited them to the reception. They had probably wandered in by accident. Or maybe someone on Cord's staff had quietly made sure they were not turned away at the door. Cord was not performing for them. There were no cameras pointed at him. There was nothing political about the moment. He was just standing with them, listening, and the expression on his face was the same one he wore in every other situation. Serious, present, and completely real. One of the refugees, an older woman with a tired face and a child holding her hand, said something to him. He responded. Whatever he said made her close her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, she looked slightly less like someone carrying an impossible weight. Velshara watched this for longer than she intended to. Then she moved on and told herself it meant nothing. The second thing happened 3 days later. A Valdori general named Harith, who had made his career on the border campaigns and had no interest in peace, had been making things difficult in the negotiating ruse. He was not openly hostile. He was too smart for that. He simply introduced complications, questions that had no good answers, technical objections that required days to resolve. He was buying time, and everyone knew it, but nobody could stop him without creating a bigger problem. Cord requested a private meeting with General Harith. Nobody was sure that was a good idea. Cord went anyway. Velshara found out about the meeting afterward through Sovran, who had placed a listening device in the room, because he was Sovran, and that was how he operated. Cord had sat down across from Harith, and had not wasted any time. He had laid out, in calm and specific terms, exactly what Harith stood to lose if the war continued. Not in vague political language, in numbers, specific numbers, about supply chains, about population loss in Harith's home district, about the 3 mining operations that funded his family's wealth, and how 2 of them sat in zones that would be the next major battlefield if the treaty failed. He had information that Harith had not known anyone on the human side possessed. Then Cord had said something that Sovran reported almost word for word, because it was too precise to paraphrase. "I'm not asking you to want peace," Cord had said. "I'm asking you to want the things you already want. Peace just happens to be the way you get them." Harith had been quiet for a long time. Then he had agreed to stop raising complications. After hearing this, Velshara sat in her private room and thought about the man she had been assigned to marry for nearly 20 minutes, which was longer than she usually thought about anyone. The third thing was the soldiers. Cord's personal guard, a small group of veterans who had served with him for years, were stationed on the lower levels of the station. Velshara encountered them one evening when she took a different route back to her quarters than usual. They were playing a card game at a small table near a corridor junction. When they saw her, they stood immediately, formal and correct. She stopped. She did not usually talk to soldiers below officer rank, but something made her stop. She asked them about Cord. Not officially, she just asked. And they told her. They told her about the bridge. 9 soldiers, 6 days, no resupply, and Cord had not slept for 4 of those days because he spent the nights moving between positions to keep everyone awake and in the right place. They told her about a battle called Mirren's Gap, where Cord had taken a piece of shrapnel in his left shoulder and had not mentioned it to anyone for 11 hours because they were in the middle of something and he did not want to shift focus. They told her about the field hospital, the White Flag, the enemy unit that switched sides a week later. One of the soldiers, a woman named Sergeant Daya, said something that stayed with Velshara long after she had left the corridor. "He never asks anything from us that he hasn't already done himself," Daya said. "And he never lets us feel like we're alone in it, no matter what it is. Some commanders make you brave because you're afraid of them. He makes you brave because you don't want to let him down." Velshara walked back to her quarters slowly that night. She had been given a translation of the word Sharvaroth when the war first began. The unbreakable, her translators had said. She had taken that to mean something physical. A man too stubborn to die. A soldier too dangerous to stop. But she had been a ruler long enough to know that the most unbreakable things were not bodies. Bodies broke. They bled, and they aged, and they broke. What did not break was the thing inside him, the part that kept showing up, kept adapting, kept caring, even after 14 years of a war that had ground better men into dust. She thought about all of this for a long time that night. She still did not know what she felt about it, but she was no longer certain that she felt nothing. The attack came on a Tuesday. Nobody picks Tuesday for a crisis, which is probably why it worked as well as it did in the first 10 minutes. Everyone's attention was on a particularly difficult session in the main negotiating room, where the Terran diplomats and the Valdori legal team had been arguing about territorial boundaries for 6 hours and were starting to raise their voices. Security was watching the negotiating rooms. Security was watching the docking bays. Security was watching all the places where trouble was expected to come from. The anti-peace faction hit the mid-levels. There were 11 of them. They moved fast and they moved together, and within 4 minutes they had sealed off 3 decks of the station, pulled the emergency bulkheads, and taken 42 hostages. The hostages included 9 members of the Terran diplomatic support staff, a Valdori junior ambassador, and various station crew members who had simply been in the wrong corridor at the wrong moment. The faction's leader sent a single message to both delegations. His name was Commander Vel Rashk, a former Valdori military officer who had lost his entire unit in a battle 3 years earlier, and had decided that peace was a betrayal of everything they had died for. He was not irrational. That was what made him dangerous. His message was calm and clear. He wanted the treaty dissolved and the negotiations ended. If that did not happen within 2 hours, he would begin executing hostages, starting with the Terran staff. The station went into full lockdown. In the main command room, both delegations crowded around screens and argued. The Valdori Imperial Guard commander wanted to send a full breach team through the bulkheads on the east side. The Terran military attaché wanted to cut power to the mid-levels and move in under cover of darkness. 3 other people were talking at the same time. Everyone had a plan. None of the plans were good. Velshara stood near the back of the room and said nothing. She was watching the screens. She was watching the timer counting down the 2 hours. She was thinking about the 42 people on the other side of the sealed bulkheads. And she was thinking about what happened to hostages when breach teams went through walls. Cord was standing beside her. He had been quiet since the first alert came through. He was looking at the station schematic on the left screen, the one showing the mid-level layout, and he was very still in the way that she had come to recognize meant he was not idle. He was calculating. He turned to her. "I need you to listen to me for 30 seconds, he said. The room was loud. She could barely hear him. She stepped closer. "A breach team triggers a response," he said. "Vel Rashk is waiting for a breach team. He has covered positions at every choke point on those 3 decks. A large force goes in, people die. Hostages first, then soldiers." He looked at the schematic again. 1 person moving through the secondary maintenance shaft on the north side, the one that connects to the lower ventilation run, comes out behind the covered positions. The math changes completely. 1 person cannot handle 11 armed fighters and secure 42 hostages, she said. 1 person can change where the problem is, he said, and then it becomes manageable. She looked at him. She knew what he was saying. She knew who the 1 person was. "There are 11 of them," she said. "I know the number," he said. "You could be killed." He did not answer that immediately. He looked at the timer on the screen. Then he looked at her. And it was not the look of a man performing bravery for an audience. It was a quiet, honest look. The kind that only happens when someone has already made their decision and is just letting you see it. "It's the right call," he said simply. She wanted to argue. She understood tactics well enough to know he was probably correct. She understood the numbers, but there was something else happening in her chest that was not about tactics, and she did not examine it closely because she did not have time. "If you go in there and do not come back," she said quietly, "I will be very unhappy." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Close to one. "I'll come back," he said. He said it like a fact, like a thing he already knew. Then he was gone, moving toward the north corridor, before anyone in the room had fully registered what was happening. What followed was told later, in pieces, from different sources. A station sensor here, a comm fragment there, an account from one of the hostages who saw part of it, from inside a locked storage room. No single account was complete. Velshara would spend weeks afterward assembling the full picture from everything that came in. What she had in the moment was the sensor feeds, which showed movement in the maintenance shafts, and then stopped showing anything useful, because Cord moved through sections the sensors did not fully cover. She had a comm channel open, on low priority, that produced nothing but silence for 31 minutes. She stood in the command room and watched the timer. People around her were still arguing about breach plans. She stopped hearing them. She was watching the timer and the sensor feeds and the one empty comm channel. And she was very still, and she did not let her face show anything. At the 29th minute, the lights on the mid-level flickered. Then, the comm channel crackled. "North bulkhead," Cord's voice said. "Open it now." She gave the order before the words were fully finished. The bulkhead opened. The hostages came through first, moving fast, guided by Cord's people, who had repositioned the moment they heard his voice. Then, station security moved in on the mid-levels, and found 8 of Velrashk's fighters already contained, disarmed, restrained, sitting on the floor of a corridor. And the remaining 3 had surrendered when their communications cut out, and they realized they had no information on what was happening. Velrashk himself came through last, in restraints, with an expression of cold fury, and something underneath the fury that might have been confusion. And then Cord came through the bulkhead. He was walking. That was the first thing she noted. He was upright and moving under his own power. The second thing she noted was the dark stains spreading through the left side of his shirt, low on his ribs, where something had caught him. He sat down on the floor of the corridor, not dramatically, the way a person sits down when their body has decided that standing is no longer the priority. She was not sure when she had started moving. She was simply there, and then she was kneeling, and her hands were already reaching for the medkit on the wall panel beside her, because she had noted its location when she entered the corridor earlier, because she always noted those things. It was what rulers who intended to survive learned to do. He looked up at her. His face was pale and tired, and he had a cut above one eye she had not noticed from a distance. "Told you," he said. His voice was steady. Even now, even bleeding on the floor of a station corridor, with 42 freed hostages being guided past them, even with the whole weight of a 14-year war still hanging in the air above the peace talks in the rooms above them, he was steady. She pressed the med patch to his side with both hands. He did not make a sound. She did not say anything for a moment. She was doing something she very rarely did. She was not thinking about what to say. She was not calculating the right words for the situation. She was just there, in the corridor, with her hands on his side, and the thought that moved through her without permission was a very simple one. She did not want him to be hurt. Not as a political calculation, not as a concern for the treaty. Just that. Just him. She filed this information away with great care and said nothing about it. "You need a medical team," she said. "Probably," he agreed. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she called for the medical team and stood up, and made sure her face was composed before she turned back to the room full of people waiting for her next command. Behind her, she heard one of his soldiers say something quietly to Cord, and she heard his response, low, almost amused, but she did not look back. The Grand Accord Hall had been built for exactly one kind of moment. High ceilings, white stone floors, long rows of seats filled with delegates, ambassadors, and senior officers from both sides. Every major broadcasting network in the known galaxy had a feed running. Hundreds of millions of people across dozens of worlds were watching on screens in homes and public squares and government buildings. Two civilizations that had been killing each other for 14 years were about to watch someone pick up a pen. The hall was full and quiet in the way that full rooms get quiet when something real is about to happen. Velshara stood at the front of the hall beside the treaty table. She was dressed in the deep blue of the first house, her silver-white hair down for the first time at a formal event, which her advisors had suggested, and which she had agreed to without fully examining why. She looked exactly as a queen was supposed to look. Strong, composed, untouchable. Cord stood a few feet away. He was in his dress uniform, the same one he had arrived in. There was a faint tension at his left side where the wound had been treated 4 days earlier. He stood straight and gave no sign of it. He looked as he always looked, like a man who had already accepted whatever was going to happen next, and was simply waiting for it to begin. The head Terran diplomat, a woman named Chancellor Reyes, stepped to the podium to begin the formal opening remarks. She spoke about the cost of the war. She spoke about the future. She used careful, polished language that said important things in ways that would offend nobody. Then the Valdori High Counselor, an elderly man named Sovath, who had outlasted 5 different political crises, gave his own address. Also careful, also polished, also correct in every way. The treaty was then brought forward. 2 copies, one in Terran Standard, one in Valdori formal script. Both already reviewed. Both already agreed upon, every line argued over and settled in the weeks of negotiations that had just ended. All that remained was the signing. It was at this point that Cord stepped forward. Nobody had been told he was going to speak. It was not in the program. Reyes looked at him. Sovath looked at him. Velshara looked at him. He did not look at any of them. He looked at the hall. He spoke without notes. He said that he had been a soldier for 21 years. He said that in those 21 years he had learned one thing above everything else, which was that the numbers in official reports did not feel like anything until you understood what they represented. So he was going to say what they represented, and he was going to say it plainly, because the people in this hall deserved plain speech more than they deserved polished language. He named the dead. Not all of them. There were too many for that. He named the battles. He described, in simple and specific terms, what the 14 years had actually cost. Not in territory or resources, in people. He talked about a Terran colony called Mirren, where 4,000 civilians had died in a single orbital strike. He talked about a Valdori transport ship called the Seridath that had been carrying wounded soldiers home when it was destroyed, and how 230 of those soldiers never made it. He talked about the field hospital under the white flag, and the soldiers on both sides who had looked at each other over the wounded, and chosen, for one moment, to be people before they were enemies. The hall was completely silent. He did not make humanity sound like heroes. He did not make the Valdori sound like villains, or the other way around. He made everyone in the room sound like what they actually were. People who had been in a terrible situation for a very long time, and had done terrible things inside it, and had also done extraordinary things inside it, and who were now being given one chance to make a different choice. When he finished, there was no applause. The silence held for several seconds, the kind of silence that is not empty, but full. Then, slowly, it broke. The diplomats were ready to move to the signing. The program called for Velshara and the Terran representative to sign first, with Cord signing as the bonded witness in the Valdori ceremony tradition. Cord did not move to the witness position. Instead, he turned to face Velshara fully. The cameras caught it. Every screen in every room in every world watching the feed caught it. He went down on one knee. Not a formal Valdori bow, not a military salute, a single knee on the white stone floor, his back straight, his eyes on her face. It was a simple gesture, without theater, without performance. The kind of gesture that meant something because it was not designed to mean something. It just did. The hall made a sound, not quite a gasp, something softer than that. "I was given orders to marry you to end the war," Cord said. His voice carried clearly in the silent hall. Those orders made sense. Peace is worth it. I understood that from the first day. He paused. But I've spent enough time around you now to know that you are not someone who should have things decided for her. So I'm asking, instead of reporting for duty. A very faint line of something appeared at the corner of his mouth. Will you? Valshara stood very still. She had ruled an empire for 11 years. She had faced rebellions, assassinations, economic crises, and wars. She had stood in front of hostile generals and talked them down without raising her voice. She had made 1,000 decisions that affected millions of lives, and she had made every single one of them with clarity and control. She had absolutely no idea what her face was doing right now. She looked at him, at this battered, difficult, impossible human man, kneeling on a stone floor in a hall full of cameras and diplomats, and the weight of 14 years. She thought about the ration bar in the corridor. She thought about old Valdori in the reception hall. She thought about her hands pressing a med patch to his side in a station corridor, while he said, "Told you," with a voice like steady stone. She thought about what Sergeant Daya had said. He never lets us feel like we're alone in it. She stepped forward and took his hand. Yes, she said, simply, without calculation. The hall broke apart at that point, not into chaos, but into something that sounded like relief, like a breath that had been held for a very long time, being slowly let out. People were standing. Some of the delegates were saying things in their own languages that the translators were not bothering to translate because the moment did not need words. The treaty was signed. Both copies, every required signature in place. The war that had lasted 14 years and cost more than either side could fully count, ended not with a battle, but with ink on paper and a man on one knee. Later, after the cameras were gone and the hall had emptied, and the diplomatic teams had gone to argue about implementation schedules, Valshara sat in her private room with Sovereign, who had the expression of a man who had witnessed something he was not sure history had a category for. He asked her what she thought of Cord now. After everything, after all of it. She was quiet for a while, long enough that Sovereign thought she might not answer. Then she said, "I think the Terrans did not survive this war, despite being human. I think they survived it because of it." She looked at the window, at the stars outside. "And I think we should all be very grateful," she said, "that they wanted peace." Sovereign nodded slowly. He thought about the man who had learned old Valdori from battlefield scraps, who had heard 3 assassins coming through old ventilation shafts, who had walked alone into a hostage crisis and come back bleeding with everyone alive. "Yes," he said quietly, "I think that too." Outside, across the galaxy, on human worlds and Valdori worlds, and all the neutral places in between, people were watching the news feeds replay the moment on the stone floor. Some were crying. Some were laughing. Some were doing both. The war was over. The universe was slightly better than it had been yesterday. And somewhere on the station, in a medical bay that he had been told to stay in for another 24 hours, Commander Elias Cord was almost certainly already ignoring that instruction and doing something else entirely. Some things, after all, do not change.